share a link after the event is complete. At this time, I would like to officially start the webinar, so welcome everyone. It is a great pleasure to be publicly launching VERTIC's NIM program legislation survey templates. So for those who don't know us, VERTIC is a London-based non-profit organization established in 1986 and devoted exclusively to verification, implementation, and compliance with respect to international agreements. We have 3 programs: verification and monitoring, compliance measures and mechanisms, and national implementation measures. Today, we will discuss the work of our National Implementation Measures team, which includes myself as Program Director, our Senior Legal Officer, Yasmin Balsi, and Associate Legal Officers, Thomas Brown and Susanna Koshabi. So the so-called NIM program was officially established more than 10 years ago now, building on initial work at VERTIC on the national implementation of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Its mandate today is to work on the universalization and legislative implementation of a number of international instruments, such as treaties, resolutions, codes of conduct, and guidelines. And the NIM program's primary focus has been agreements concerning the non-proliferation and disarmament of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons and the security of related materials, with expanding work today in areas such as the international health regulations. If you're interested in learning more about the program, I'd invite you to read the article, which details you can see on the screen. That gives a bit more information about the history and the expansion of the program. Our most recent projects focus on biological and chemical weapons non-proliferation, biological and chemical security, universalization and implementation of the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, and non-proliferation and disarmament law. Those projects are VERTIC-led or implemented by a consortium of organizations, but in both cases, we work in close cooperation or coordination with a number of international partners, including the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, the UN Office for Counterterrorism, the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, the BWC Implementation Support Unit, the EU Non-Proliferation Disarmament Consortium, and so on. Our activities include researching, publishing, and lecturing on those topics, but our core work is to provide legislative assistance to states worldwide to assist them in giving effect to their international obligations in their national legal frameworks. We do so by firstly raising awareness on international obligations in relevant instruments, and we do so during events and through publications and tools. Secondly, we analyze existing legislation to identify gaps and areas requiring strengthening. And thirdly, we assist in drafting or reviewing, amending, or new legislation during workshops or remotely. I will now hand over to Yasmin to further introduce our legislative analysis work and methodology. Yasmin, over to you.
Thank you, Sonia. Can I just confirm that you can see and hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. So as Sonia said, the NIM program has been involved in analyzing states implementing legislation for the BWC, the CWC, and related instruments such as UN Security Council Resolution 1540 for over a decade now. Our engagement with states and our participation in diplomatic and technical processes have really allowed us to build an understanding of states' approaches to national implementation. So our expertise is very much built on our understanding of implementing international obligations into national legislation. The BWC and CWC legislation survey templates, the subject matter of our webinar today, are tools that we develop to help us and the countries that we work with to examine national legislation against the requirements of the BWC, CWC, and related instruments. So these tools really help us see what relevant legislation is already in place and what may be missing. When we use the BWC and CWC legislation survey templates to create completed country-specific legislation surveys, we go through a whole range of legislative documents. We analyze laws, regulations, decrees, administrative documents, and in addition, we also go through a whole range of areas of law. For example, we go through the criminal codes and procedural codes of a country, any treaty-specific or weapon-specific legislation, export control, trade, customs laws, public health, animal health, plant health and protection laws, occupational health and safety laws, etc. So we really aim to be comprehensive and also detailed. We analyze the provisions that we find to the letter. So to date, we have over 145 completed country-specific legislation surveys, and we use them as an assistance and reference tool. They're not meant as a compliance analysis. As I said, we try to be as comprehensive and detailed as possible, but every survey will have faced access and language barriers, so we see them very much as a reference and as an assistance tool. The BWC and CWC legislation survey templates, as I said, they are our in-house tools that have been developed and adjusted over the years by both current and former NIM staff. They underwent a major revision in 2020, for which we would like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Norway for their financial support. And with this webinar, we are today now launching them publicly. They're now published documents on our website. And by doing so, we very much hope that we will reach, of course, a wider audience. First and foremost, state officials and legislators to use these tools independently to examine their national legislation, but also for anyone else interested in biological and chemical weapons and in how legal frameworks should address these issues. So with that, it is time to look at the exact content of each of the templates. So I will hand over to my colleague, Thomas Brown, who will take us through the BWC legislation survey template.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Can I just confirm that you can see this?
Yes, I can see your screen and yourself.
Perfect. Well, yeah, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be able to run very briefly with you today through the survey template for national implementation measures for the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention and biological weapons related provisions of relevant international instruments. So this is the template that you're seeing on screen. I will quickly run through them. Yasmin dealt a lot already with the introduction, so I will go straight to the text of the survey, which you should be able to see on your screen. So when we would be filling out the survey, part of the idea behind publishing the survey is, as Yasmin said, so that stakeholders can use this tool and analyze their own legislation. So to use the tool, you would write the state name, for example, in here, in this text box, and then the survey begins with a section on adherence to international instruments related to biological weapons. Now, when we conduct our legislative analysis, we look broader than just the BWC because there are a number of related provisions in other international instruments. So we also take into account the 1925 Geneva Protocol, the Beijing Convention on the Suppression of Unlawful Acts related to International Civil Aviation, the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts against the Safety of Maritime Navigation, the Protocol for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts against the Safety of Fixed Platforms located on the continental shelf, the International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and the 2000 Amendment to this Rome Statute. And finally, we also take into consideration United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540. In the right-hand column here, you see a number of links, and these links will take you to if you click on them, they will take you to the depository page of the various international instruments. On this page, you will be able to see the status of the states in question, whether they've signed or ratified the treaty, and that will help to inform the analysis. So now for the actual survey. So our survey begins in section A by looking at definitions. So it's important for states to include a number of definitions in their implementing legislation. Once we've searched through a state's legislative provisions and found a definition or provision that could match, we would include it in the right-hand column here. So I've included an example from a country's BWC law here. You can see here that there is a definition of the term biological agent, which largely fits the definition that is found in international guidance. Section B of the template concerns offences and penalties. So when states draft implementing legislation, they should criminalise a number of behaviours and activities involving biological weapons. This can include, for example, the development, manufacture, acquisition, stockpile, possession, etc. of biological weapons. And again, on the right-hand side here, I have included an example of a provision from a state's BWC Act. So here on section 1, you can see that it says that no person shall develop, produce, stockpile, acquire, or retain any biological agent or toxin of a type and in a quantity that has no justification for prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. And that directly matches Article 4 of the Biological Weapons Convention. We also, as I mentioned previously, we take into account offences related to biological weapons on aircraft, ships, fixed platforms, and public spaces under the various instruments that I outlined earlier. Section B also includes other offences related to war crimes, which are found under the Rome Statute and the 2017 Amendment, and offences related to misuse of biological agents and toxins. And these are drawn from United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540, operative paragraph 3. Section C of the template concerns participation in offences. So when states are drafting or implementing legislation, they'll have to criminalise participation in some of the offences that I mentioned already in B. This can be things like assisting any activity that's prohibited, encouraging, inducing, ordering, organising and directing, etc. I won't go into detail too much about this section. My colleague Susanna will do it when she runs through the CWC template, but some of the measures here are often found in a country's criminal code, for example. Section D, as you should see on the screen here, concerns jurisdiction over offences in B and C. So these measures will enable a state to exercise jurisdictional control over alleged perpetrators of some of the offences that we've already talked about. Again, I've included an example in the right-hand column of a country's protection against terrorism law. So under section 15 of this law, the court of the state has jurisdiction in respect to any specified offence if the offence was committed by a citizen of the state or a person ordinarily resident in the state. This is an example of exercising jurisdiction, a provision which would allow a state to exercise jurisdiction on the basis of nationality. This is one of the allowed bases of jurisdiction under international law, and we include a number of other bases within section D. Section E looks at control lists, both for dangerous biological agents and toxins, and also control lists for dual-use biological equipment and related technology and software. Now, some states take different approaches to drafting control lists. Some will come up completely with their own control lists, and other states may be informed, their lists may be informed by international lists, such as the Australia Group list, for example. Section F builds on these control lists by looking at a number of control measures to account for, secure, and physically protect dangerous biological agents and toxins. So the measures to account for, secure, and physically protect, these are taken from Security Council Resolution 1540, operative paragraph 3. And one thing I want to mention in section F is that, as you'll see on the screen in a minute, we also include a number of kind of biosecurity measures, such as background checks for personnel undertaking activities involving biological agents and toxins, biosecurity awareness, measures to restrict access to dangerous biological agents or toxins, things like that. A lot of these measures that we've included in the template draw from international non-binding guidance. For example, the World Health Organization's biosafety and biosecurity manuals. We include these to be as comprehensive as possible and make sure that our templates are up to date with the latest biosecurity guidance. Section G of the survey template looks at measures to control transfers of agents, toxins, equipment, and technology. So these could be things like an import-export control authority, transit control, export control, import control. And again, these draw from operative paragraph 3 of Resolution 1540. And then finally, to ensure practical implementation of the BWC and related international instruments, Section H concerns the enforcement. So these could be measures to create national authorities, measures to facilitate inspections, also measures to facilitate criminal proceedings so that perpetrators of offences under B and C can be prosecuted under national law. Once we've completed our analysis and filled out all the relevant boxes, which we are able to, we then go on to create a survey overview, which you should see on the screen now. A survey overview is essentially a summary document, often a short document, which summarizes the findings of the survey and also includes a number of recommendations. So when we would be filling out the overview template, again, you could type the name in of the state here, the date of the BWC survey, the laws and regulations included in the survey, and also any laws and regulations necessary to complete the survey. To provide an example of the recommendations, here I have drafted just an example. So country D has implemented a number of definitions for implementation of the BWC in its legislation. However, the definition for the term biological weapon could not be found, and it is recommended that such a definition is adopted. This is quite a short and simple recommendation, but it gives you a flavour of exactly the kind of thing that we would recommend. The idea is that the recommendations are practical and that a relevant stakeholder, for example, a government official or a legislative drafter perhaps, could then, if it was in the national interest, go and make some amendments to the implementing legislation. These could be done by amending an existing piece of legislation or by drafting new legislation. That completes the look at the BWC survey, and I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Susanna, who will run through the CWC template. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Hello, everybody. I'm going to go through the CWC template now as well. I'll just share my screen so that you can see it. Okay, just checking everyone can see and hear me in my slides. Okay.
Yes, Susanna, all good.
Thank you. Okay. So I'll be doing a run through now of the survey template for national implementation measures for the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention and chemical weapons related provisions of relevant international instruments. This template is similar in many ways to the BWC template that Thomas just presented. So I will now go through some of the other sections and sections that are unique to the CWC template specifically. Okay. So firstly, as my colleagues have explained, this template analyzes states' legislation as part of their obligation to adopt national implementation measures under Article 7 of the Chemical Weapons Convention. It also takes into account decisions from the CWC Conference of State Parties and measures for the chemical weapons related obligations of UN Security Council Resolution 1540, as well as under other international treaties relating to civil aviation, maritime navigation, terrorism, and international crimes. It also comes with a survey overview template. Thomas has just demonstrated how to use that for the BWC template, and as this one is largely similar, I won't go through it in too much detail again. So if we go on to the survey template itself, okay, so you can see here that it's divided into 7 sections and ultimately identifies 163 national implementation measures. It has a similar introduction and then an introductory section here on adherence to international instruments, this time related to chemical weapons, where you can also follow the links as Thomas demonstrated. After this, we get to the main body of the survey. As Yasmin mentioned, to fill these sections out, we would look at measures in legislation, regulations, decrees, administrative acts, and other relevant official documents of a state. So these could come in weapon-specific laws, treaty-specific laws, criminal laws, export control and trade laws, or chemical safety and environmental laws. So Thomas took you through definitions, as well as section B, which is also offences and penalties. He also went through section D, jurisdictions. So I will start now on section C. So here we go. So this section refers to criminal liability for participation in offences and related penalties. Several laws might apply to this section. I've used examples from what I will refer to as country A and country B to show how to fill out the template. In practice, of course, you'd only be looking at one country's legislation. So we can see here in C1, country A's CWC Implementation Act is actually relevant here. Article 6 prohibits assistance, encouragement, or inducing anyone to engage in prohibited CWC activities with related penalties here of fines, imprisonment, or both. We can see that these provisions would actually apply to sections C2 and C3, encouragement and inducing. So we could refer back to them, back to the law and provision in C1, as I've done here. I also wanted to point out in section C that, an example of a country's criminal code. So you can see here that country A's criminal code also includes a general provision on aiding and abetting, which would be relevant here. Now, if I move on to offences relating to financing the prohibited activities covered in section B, this is required by UN Security Council Resolution 1540. So these could be found either in a dedicated anti-terrorist financing or anti-money laundering law or in a state's criminal code. So country A, for example, contains the following offence and penalty in its criminal code for supporting terrorist activity. So with that, I think I'll move on to section E. Here you can see section D is jurisdiction. Okay. So section E concerns the establishment of national control lists of scheduled chemicals, as well as related dual-use chemical equipment, technology, and software. A country's main CWC implementing law, such as that of country A is seen here, should include a reference to lists of scheduled chemicals. It should also include measures enabling the relevant person or authority to update these lists. And then section F right underneath covers control measures for scheduled chemicals, as well as unscheduled discrete organic chemicals and dual-use chemical equipment, software, and technology. So these control measures would entail restrictions on certain activities. For example, their use, acquisition, or retention without proper licensing or authorization. Country B, here as an example, Chemical Weapons Act would fit in section F1. We can also see that as it relates to the production of Schedule 1 toxic chemicals, that it would also apply in section F2 underneath here. So I've referred back to it. If I scroll through section F, you can see that it goes on to cover Schedule 2 chemicals, Schedule 3 chemicals, and the other measures that I mentioned. Okay. So if we move on lastly to section G, this section covers legislative enforcement measures. So provisions here relate to measures such as inspections, criminal investigations, and prosecutions. If we take country B's Chemical Weapons Act as an example again here, we can see that it contains a provision relating to inspections. Here we go, which is aligned with the Chemical Weapons Convention. We can also see that the same law, the Chemical Weapons Act, facilitates entry, forfeiture, and seizure by authorities of evidence in relation to suspected offences. So these provisions would go under G13 here. We may also find in section G that a state's criminal code, as well as strategic trade or export control laws, may also be relevant. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the template. We can see here again that the CWC survey template also has an accompanying survey overview template, which should be used in the same way as Thomas explained for the BWC overview. It's a qualitative assessment of a state's national implementation measures. It could be a gap analysis and also could be used to make recommendations for any potential to strengthen a state's legislative framework. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. And if you have any questions, please do post them in the Q&A function. I will now hand back to Sonia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Susanna and Thomas, for the presentation of the survey templates. So we are now happy to take a few questions before we conclude our webinar. And I see we already have one. So someone asked us if the completed surveys and survey overviews using the new templates would be made publicly available. So no, our approach is that we do not share the country-specific legislation analysis publicly. We only share them with the interested country, although we do encourage those countries to share those surveys with partners and interested organizations if they wish to do so. But we keep them, the surveys, confidential. Then, of course, if a country decides to complete the survey themselves, it is up to them to decide whether they want to make them publicly available or not. But perhaps my colleague wanted to comment on this question as well. Yasmin, for example, perhaps you would like to add a few comments to that?
Yeah, as we already mentioned during our presentations, at the moment they're very much meant as our tools when we engage with states to really use it as really a first beginning to fully examine the legislation. So at the moment, it was already a big step for us to finally publish the templates. So, we're focusing on that for now and using the completed ones as our tools for our engagement directly with the states.
Thank you, Yasmin. And then another follow-up questions we have is, will there be a template for the international instruments for nuclear security? So as you've gathered, those templates focus on the implementation of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention. We are also working on nuclear security legislative implementation. At the moment, we are not working on the publication of the nuclear security survey template, but this is something that we would certainly consider in the future. Now, see, we have another question that relates to more of the state of national implementation of the BWC and CWC. And I'll read it now. So how many states parties have not yet fully implemented their national obligations under the BWC and the CWC? Well, thank you very much for that question. So as I was saying, it relates more to the actual completion of the survey templates and what lessons we can learn from that. So to date, VERTIC has completed on the basis of the templates, but in their older version, so not the revised version, we have completed over 145 country-specific surveys. And in 2016, we published a report on the state of the national implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention that gives a bit more information on how the convention is being implemented and what remains to be done. So I would encourage you to have a look on our website at the 2016 BWC Implementing Legislation Report. that gives a bit more information as to where things are in terms of the implementation of the BWC. And we intend to publish something similar in the coming month. So perhaps in time for the BWC review conference, we'll have updated our statistics and give a better overview of what the state of implementation of the BWC is. I'm happy for my colleagues to follow up on that comment, if you wish. No.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to briefly say that implementing the BWC and the CWC is a kind of a continuing process. So we are constantly, sometimes we would complete a survey for a state, and then a few years later laws can become outdated, or the CWC has just been revised for the first time very recently. So it is a continuous process, and it's something that we find through our work that states need to be on top of, revising their laws to make sure they take into account the latest international guidance, for example, or any changes at the international level. I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Thomas. And we also have another comment, more than a question about the survey. So thank you very much for asking and commenting. So the person notes that these survey templates are very useful as a first step in assessing national implementation. However, how do you make sure they do not create a false sense of security? Just because the law exists on paper, this does not mean it is properly implemented. Similarly, just because a national authority exists, that does not mean it is properly staffed or funded. Perhaps Yasmin, you would like to take that question?
Sure, yes. I guess to start with, that is true. The implementing legislation is definitely only the first step. However, I'd like to take it one step back because, as we just heard from the previous question, the implementation levels across the conventions are actually still quite low, and we shouldn't underestimate the absolute necessity of having implementing legislation in place. For example, with criminal measures, having these in place, you may never have to rely on them, hopefully not, but at least they are there. And if something happens in your country, you can at least rely on those criminal offenses that you have adopted. So in that sense, I think already adopting measures on paper, if you will, is already a huge achievement, and we already have a long way to go. But of course, the actual practical operational enforcement of the law is a whole other matter that also requires time and resources and different partners. So in that sense, when we reach out to states, we do try to be clear that, yes, we are focusing only on legislative implementation, but that is definitely not the only part of national implementation. And we refer to other partners that can help in terms of providing more operational assistance as well.
Thanks, Yasmin. I'd like to address one last question, perhaps, before we conclude, because this will be a nice transition to a few things we wanted to mention about the National Implementation Measures Program assistance offer. So we have one nice comment. Thank you very much for sharing and making available these useful tools. And then when conducting the surveys and providing recommendations, does VERTIC also support countries in identifying the type of legislative instruments, for example, law, decree, resolution, best suited to address any identified gaps? So first, I wanted to clarify that we do work, and we can work closely with any interested countries to complete those legislation surveys. The templates are available on our website, but we're also happy to work closely with any interested countries to complete or review the surveys, then work together on the findings and the recommendations coming out of the survey, and discuss possible next steps, which naturally would be to draft new legislation to fully give effect to the BWC and the CWC, or amending legislation. So in doing so, when we work with the countries on drafting legislation, yes, we discuss with them what the best approach would be, either to adopt a new comprehensive, for example, BWC implementing act, or to amend several laws and regulations that will give effect to the convention. And depending on each country, because there is no one size fits all, of course, a law may be more appropriate, or a decree would be best for certain provisions. Usually, for example, for detailed biosecurity measures or detailed chemical security measures, it may be best placed in manuals or codes of conduct that will be developed at the national level. So this is something that we do discuss with the countries, and then based on what works best for them, then we help them draft the necessary measures. I'm not sure if my colleague would like to add anything to that. No, all good. Thank you. So I don't think we have any other questions. So that on that last note, I actually wanted to show you where you can find the survey templates on our website. So I'll start sharing my screen now. There you go. Yes. So this is the VERTIC website, which conveniently shows the national implementation measures page. So if you're interested in seeing the survey templates on our website, you need to go to Program, then National Implementation Measures. If you're interested in the Biological Weapons Convention template, you click on the Biological Weapons and Material page. And here you will find our BWC implementing pages with some basic information about the BWC and its implementation. And there are a number of useful tools on the right column. And the survey templates can be found under the Legislative Analysis Tool tab. So you click on the tab, and then the survey template is available here. And then you click on this one. So both survey templates for the BWC and the CWC are currently available in English only, but we will be publishing them in other languages, including Arabic, Russian, French, and Spanish in the near future. So to those of you who are interested, we'll be happy to share the information. We'll also publish it on our website and Twitter and Facebook. So it should be available in the near future. There are other tools that you may find useful on our webpage. So before we get to the stage of legislative analysis, we also raise awareness on the BWC and the CWC and their national implementation. So you can have a look, for example, at our fact sheets for the implementation of the BWC, the national authority for the BWC, and there's also a few fact sheets on the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And those fact sheets have been revised recently as well, and they're available in different languages already. And then if you're interested in our legislative assistance offer, so again, as I mentioned, we're happy to work with any interested countries on developing legislation surveys, drafting legislation, organizing workshops. At the moment, I'm afraid it's only online workshops, but in the future, we hope to be able to travel again so we can organize them in country. To raise awareness on those conventions and work on implementing legislation. So the information is also available on our website, and I believe we've shared our email address earlier as well. So thank you very much. I think that's all we wanted to present to you today. I don't know if Thomas, Susanne, or Yasmin have any other follow-up comments or remarks.
No, that sounds good.
Thank you very much. Well, it was a great pleasure to be speaking with you today. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us. We also welcome any feedback. If you notice that something is not working with the survey templates, please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. And with that, well, thank you very much for your time. And we look forward to hearing from you very soon. Bye.